So now you're going to have to switch your minds, switch to another gear, another set of issues, and again, very important issues. Encouraging greater participation of women in public life and increasing the participation of women in politics. And again, I think we're very fortunate to have two significant experts in this field. And the order in which they are going to speak is that firstly Yvonne Galligan, and secondly Gail McElroy. Yvonne obtained her BA and MA from UCD and a doctorate from Trinity. She's held lecturing posts in UCD, TCD, University of Limerick, University College Cork, and has been at the School of Politics, International Studies and Philosophy at Queen's University Belfast since 2000. Her research interests focus particularly on women's political representation in Ireland and in a comparative context. And those of you who will have seen her bio, which we circulated some time ago, see the extent of her publication on this topic. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Yvonne.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The issue before us now looks at how we can assist women as inhabitants of this state to be fully involved in public and political life. It is a wide brief, and I will focus on the more general aspect of it, women's participation in public decision-making. The focus of this deliberative convention is on the Constitution, and so I will bring forward a number of issues from that point of view. First, I want to sketch some context giving rise to this issue. Then I suggest two constitutional amendments, and I'll give the advantages and disadvantages of each one in turn. So, to begin. The Constitution provides for women's and men's equal citizenship, equal right to vote and stand for election, and it also provides for civil society. These are basic democratic rights. They provide that women and men have equal rights to participate in the public life of the state. However, the practice of those rights is different. Practice is that women's participation in public and political life is not as extensive as that of men. And as a consequence, their presence in public and political decision-making forums is not equal to that of men. This has been a matter of concern for a very long time. The need to pay attention to increasing women's participation in public affairs was noted in a series of reports from the Commission on the Status of Women in the 1970s onwards. Political parties and governments have also paid attention to this issue, and civil society associations have focused on the matter as well. Yet, despite all of the good work that has gone on through the years, today, women's participation in public life and decision-making is not to the same level as that of men. So we have in 2010 an EU study on volunteering which showed that women are equal with men in their extent of volunteering in this country. And this is a point that relates to the caring discussion that we took, we had this morning. But my question is, why is that not translating into inclusion in public decision making? Much attention by government and organisations to women's participation on state boards has brought women's membership there up to 35%. This seems to be good, but that figure has remained static for quite some time. In terms of economic decision-making, for a long time, women had no say in key economic decision-making forums. Today, there is one woman among the 10 directors of the central bank. While there is a strong pool of women at middle grades in the civil service, at present, less than 1 in 5 Secretary-Generals of departments are women. These are examples of high-level decision-making that can seem remote from the lives of ordinary people. So one would then expect that women would be more visible at local level, engaging in issues that affect them and their communities and making decisions about them on their behalf. But women comprise less than 1 in 5 local councillors. About 1 in 5 county enterprise board members are women, and a little less than 1 in 3 of VEC board members are women. So clearly there's an issue here. And this brings us to a constitutional question. Should the Constitution recognise gender equality as a fundamental principle? There would be a number of advantages to a constitutional clause of this kind. It would recognise equality of the sexes as a basic principle of law and policy. In this way, it would constitutionally enshrine, in a positive manner, women's full citizenship. It would bring the Constitution closer to EU founding values of equality between women and men more generally. The EU's own gender strategy targets women's public participation as a key area of action, and Article 23 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms is concerned with this issue in the areas over where the European Union has competence. Bringing this idea into the Irish Constitution would be in keeping and indeed extend the aspiration that women and men have equal opportunities to participate in public life. Another advantage is that it would require laws and policies to consider gender equality and to ensure that women were part and parcel of decision-making around these policies. On the other hand, one could argue that such an amendment is not necessary in the Constitution, that the Constitution gives sufficient recognition to gender equality. Indeed, the Supreme Court has already said that gender equality is covered by the Constitution in Article 40.1. One could say that it would be an unnecessary policy constraint on government to have this principle in the Constitution. Gender mainstreaming is already taking place and is an embedded routine of policy making. Indeed, each memorandum to Cabinet has a gender proofing clause and has had so for some time. So the government, which is at the apex of public decision making, already imposes this obligation on itself. Thirdly, it could open up legal cases whose outcome could be costly in terms of compensation for discrimination. One cannot foretell what case could require the state to compensate for excluding women from decision-making as equals, but nonetheless, past performance shows that it is quite possible for this to arise. So this brings us to the second potential constitutional amendment. Should the Constitution allow for special measures to redress gender imbalances in public decision-making? Again, there are advantages and disadvantages to both cases. In terms of the advantages, it would allow women and men to equally share in public decision-making. It would make it a principle that women have an equal say by right to take part in public affairs, and this would pave the way for women's integration into all decision-making forums at all levels and at all arenas. It could be that Ireland could show the way in this regard across the world. Few constitutions make this provision, and Ireland could become the gold standard, a role model for other written constitutions. This is especially relevant when newly democratising countries or new states turn to addressing what's to go into their own constitutions. And that's a process that is ongoing as we speak. Thirdly, including women equally with men in all decision-making at all levels would develop a more inclusive culture for all living in Ireland. The Constitution has a powerful shaping influence on the public culture of a society. Valuing women's participation in a special amendment would change the political culture to becoming more inclusive of all citizens and their diverse needs and interests. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages to this point. One could equally argue that it is not necessary to provide for this in the Constitution, that we have plenty of safeguards in place without recourse to constitutional measures. And what is required, in fact, is more on-the-ground, practical commitment to including women in public affairs. Another argument against constitutionally providing for special measures is that it would make decision-making as it stands at the moment unworkable. What would happen if a board, say a VEC board as I mentioned, could not find sufficient women to serve on that board? Would it be unable to function? And more generally, would decision-making on important issues be held up while boards dealing with public matters were trying to get women to fill these vacancies? Difficulties in finding women with the skills and the interests, as well as the time, could be another practical argument against this constitutional provision and the effect it would impose on us. It is one that would be critical for a time, though it certainly wouldn't be critical forever. But in the meantime, the women who are available and willing to participate would be stretched to the limit. And finally, this amendment would do nothing to address the major constraint on women's participation more generally, that of caring responsibilities, about which we heard eloquent and informed discussion this morning. So I will leave these ideas with you now. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an interesting discussion shortly.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. We're now going to have Gail McElroy. Gail is a Professor of Political Science in Trinity College Dublin. Her primary research interests are in the field of legislative behaviour and party politics. Her recent publications have dealt with the nature of party competition in the European Parliament, the role of committees in the policy process, and the equality of citizen representation in the European Union. Gail is also actively involved in the Irish National Election Study and the Irish Candidate Study, and recent published work in this area explores the continued underrepresentation of women in Irish politics. Gail.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to focus in this talk more on women in elections and the continued underrepresentation of women in Irish politics. This session is a little unusual. Unlike this morning's session, or indeed the previous sessions on the presidential term or the voting age, we don't have a concrete amendment to which to put our teeth into. On the other hand, I think you should take this opportunity as a result to kind of give free rein to coming up with an amendment if you see fit, or to really decide to leave things as they are in the Constitution at present. As I said, I'm going to focus on women in elections and their continued underrepresentation. And a lot of the submissions from the women's advocacy groups deal with this in some depth. These figures are actually they're well rehearsed, and we know the fact that it's unusual. Ireland only has 15% of women parliamentarians in the lower house, in the Dáil. And this doesn't compare too favourably with our European neighbours, okay? So it's a little hard to reach over here, but we're at the end here. We're over here at the end. Compared to countries like Andorra, Sweden, Norway, Finland are kind of, those Nordic exemplars in terms of representation. The one thing I don't know if you can read that, but the one thing I would draw your attention to here is this little country at the end, Malta. And just bear in mind, for both your discussion later and also for the future meetings on the electoral system, Malta has the same electoral system as us, and that may just be coincidental, or there may be some causation there in terms of the representation of women. I would also like to kind of bring your attention to the fact that a lot of other Anglo-Saxon democracies, if you want to classify us as one, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, they also don't have large numbers of women represented in their parliaments. The United States, some would say the exemplar of democracy, only has 18% of women in the houses of Congress. So, you know, we're not entirely out of kilter with democracies that we would admire. Nonetheless, there is a puzzle, okay? Ireland has changed. Many of you will have witnessed this over the past 2 decades. There's been significant cultural shifts in the past 20 years. And yet we haven't witnessed a kind of a change in the number of women represented in Parliament. There was this big breakthrough in the 1992 election. For those of you who can remember it, we see 12% of Dáil members were women, and it's now only 15%. So we've had much higher rates of women's labour force participation, cultural changes. We have an electoral system that would typically be seen, PR systems are typically seen to be very kind to women. And the Nordic countries that have very large numbers of women in their lower houses have PR systems. But we have a peculiar form of PR, and we can discuss that in some detail later. I would like to say that Ireland, it isn't all kind of bad news. And a lot of the submissions, they make a lot of the fact that we're 109th in the world in terms of women's representation in Parliament. There are other rankings, though, that show that Ireland is actually quite good for women. So the World Economic Forum has a gender gap ranking, and we're keeping very good company. We're even beating the Danes in it. We're 5th in the world. And at the other end of that spectrum, this is a ranking that compares kind of the gap between men and women in terms of performance on indicators in both kind of political, health, education, and economic rankings. And Ireland does quite well. Nonetheless, we're kind of out of kilter, and the puzzle remains, why do we have so few women elected to our lower house, given that, there's a lot of legislation, gender mainstreaming, and a lot of legislation that's quite favourable to gender equality. Okay. So the question remains, why so low, and why haven't we witnessed kind of a gradual increase in the number of women in our Parliament? And there's a whole multitude of factors that are offered up here, and I'm only going to touch on some of them. And many of you in your discussions will come up with some more, and they're outlined in some more detail in the document. But things such as voter prejudice, recruitment, the ambition of women, kind of encapsulate kind of the bigger ideas. So here we have a graph. I like graphs, as you will see. Demonstrating the percentage of women that ran as candidates, and this is a percentage, it's not an absolute number, please bear that in mind, although the Labour Party did have both the highest percentage and the highest number in absolute terms of candidates in the 2011 election that were women. And what we'll notice is, one of the arguments will be that women run for the wrong parties, and I use that kind of term, loosely. Women do tend to run for left-wing parties, okay? They tend to be more women in the ranks of left-wing parties right across the world. And, they aren't the strongest parties in the Republic of Ireland. And so we have Labour and Sinn Féin there up at the top, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael rather lower percentages. Interestingly, and this is a very Irish phenomenon, we have a lot of independent candidates. This is not typical in other countries, and independent candidates are particularly male, let's put it like that. So, we also bear that in mind, and they won't obviously be affected by party quotas down the line. So the question is, what is it about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? Why are they running so few female candidates? And there's a couple of explanations for this. And one of the big ones is an incumbency effect. Incumbents are men, and the best single predictor of getting elected in Ireland, typically, 2011 may have been a little different for some parties, Fianna Fáil in particular, but typically the single best predictor of winning a seat is being an incumbent. Incumbents are men. Parties aren't fools. They're in the game of winning seats. They re-elect men. They shouldn't have to social engineer, some would argue. So Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have most of the incumbents. Most of the incumbents are men. They're almost certainly going to get re-elected, so they nominate them. Okay, so that's the argument. And there are less incumbents, obviously, in the smaller parties, and so they can nominate more women. Now, another kind of take on that argument is it's not just the incumbency effect. That's part of the explanation. But some would argue there's a recruitment bias in parties, and in particular in Ireland, the recruitment patterns into political parties are quite opaque, and a lot of things happen in changing rooms and GAA halls and so on and so forth, and that these may actually not be avenues that are typically open to women, and the parties don't see women because of their particular recruitment strategies. Okay, so that's a bias. Now, it may not be a conscious bias, but it's a bias that's put forward there. So that's kind of the recruitment angle of it. Another argument is that women don't come forward, okay? So this is, and parties would often say this is a supply side problem. And it has to be said that research across the world demonstrates that there is a political ambition gap. That women don't see them, I've listed it here as confidence, but women don't see themselves as qualified to run, even if by objective standards they are. They don't put themselves forward. And women also see, they perceive it, whether it's true or not, that the political arena is incredibly combative and competitive, and they don't particularly care for this. So these are figures from the Irish candidate survey, okay? So every time there's an election, we in our department, we send out surveys to all of those candidates who run. Now bear in mind, these are people who actually chose to run. These are two things we asked them. And these are female and male candidates comparing their percentages. And the argument here is that when we ask candidates, and these are women candidates who had the confidence to run, why don't women run? And there's a huge gender gap here. Women candidates say that other women don't have the confidence to put themselves forward. And also, male candidates don't seem to think this is a problem at all. And also, female candidates also say that the nature of Irish politics is just too conflictual. Women don't like it. And if you think of kind of the Nordic countries where there are a lot more women represented in Parliament, they tend to be a great deal more consensual than our kind of more conflictual style that we engage in here. Okay. Okay. Now this is one that you're going to hear. You see it in the letters pages of the Irish Times and the Irish Independent all the time, and you hear it over and over again. And if there's only one thing you remember from my talk today, okay, it's that voters are not biased against women. Okay, they really don't care about the gender of the woman. Gender is not actually, it's not politicized in the Irish Republic. Voters vote for candidates on the basis of their party. They don't care if it's a male or a female. And in fact, this kind of reflects evidence from across the world. Women perform just as well as men once they put themselves forward, okay? So there is really no evidence either in Ireland or across the world for the fact that voters won't vote for female candidates, okay? There are small numbers of voters, very, very small numbers of voters who may have a preference for one gender over another, but really these are a minimal number of people, and also it works both ways, okay? So that's the one thing. It's a very, very common perception, and you'll hear it over and over again, but there really isn't voter bias. And there's a whole host of other factors that we might want to consider. Some people will say, and I'm sure the politicians in the room will agree, that the working life of a TD is not compatible with work-life balance, okay? The hours are long, and the demands from constituents are many and numerous. They kind of expect you to be available to them, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this may be a particular problem in Ireland, but it's not. Politicians' lives are not compatible with family life the world over. So it's not a peculiarly Irish phenomenon. Another argument put forward is that we didn't traditionally have gender quotas, and it is true, and this is kind of almost a trite comment. 17 of the top 20 countries in the world in terms of the representation of women do have quotas, and we will have them in the next general election. We've touched on this already. The nature of the electoral system. Now, there may be something particular about the Irish electoral system that is unattractive to women. It's very candidate-centred. You may have, it's very unusual in Ireland to compared to the rest of the world. You have to go out and knock on doors. And this is an aspect of campaigning that has come up that women don't particularly like. They're less open to this. A lot of men don't like it either, so we may get a particular selection of people who are going forward. You have to be very, very confident and outgoing and very, willing to go to every funeral and dog race and knock on every door. And this is an aspect of the single transferable vote that's very, very candidate-centred that may be particularly unappealing to women, particularly if they dislike kind of the competitive angle. Another argument that's put across the world over, and a lot of the submissions to the convention mention this, that women disproportionately share a burden of childcare. Ireland is not peculiar in that fashion, so it's not a peculiarly Irish phenomenon. Now, we do obviously have less kind of well-provided state childcare than, say, the Nordic countries. I think this may be a particular problem in Ireland in the sense that, you know what I mean, a lot of people, when you have to campaign and you're trying to get elected, it's not the 4 weeks of the campaign that matter. You have to spend a year or two beforehand knocking on doors in your local community. And it's very hard to have a family, hold down a job, and also campaign for a year or two running up to election. You can probably do 2 out of 3 of those things, but 3 out of 3 is rather a big ask. Okay, so what do the voters want? So we also survey at every election time the citizens. So you're a representative sample of them. I thought I'd give you some kind of pointers for seeing what, you know, your fellow citizens want when they're talking about Dáil reform. And what we find is, so this is a question, now this is an aggregate. We ask people on a scale of 0 to 10, would you like a lot more young people in the Dáil? Would you like a lot more old people? And what we find is, on average, people would generally like a lot more young TDs, and they also, that's the second bar up there, they would like more female TDs. Not so keen on more old TDs and pensioners. And, you know, more kind of, they seem to be kind of neutral on Christians and lesbian and gay TDs. I'm not entirely sure what that means. But the big thing to take from here is that, as a whole, people think it's a good idea to have more young TDs and also more female TDs. But this comes with a caveat. When you ask them, when you go to vote, when you go to cast a ballot, does it matter to you that the candidate, your TD, is of the same sex as you? And what you find here of these 7 factors is the thing that's least important to them is the sex of the candidate. It's really not important to them. So this is a scale from 0 to 10. And this is averaged, of course. Having the same political viewpoint is the most important thing, although less important than one might think on a scale of 0 to 10. From the same area, that kind of Irish phenomenon, you know, the same social class comes third, but the same sex is really not important. Okay, and that's perhaps not altogether surprising. Okay, so do bear that in mind. As a whole, we think having more women TDs would be good, but as an individual, I don't really care if my own TD or my local TDs in my constituency are of the same gender as me. Okay, so, as it is a constitutional convention, the submission document that I have has lays out the pros and cons of gender quotas. We're not here to discuss gender quotas. The electoral law has been reformed, okay? And so at the next election, 30% of candidates in the next general election will have to be men and women, okay? It's written in a gender-neutral fashion. Obviously, in practice, this means that 30% of candidates will have to be women from each of the parties, and it will increase to 40% within 7 years. Now, this is only for general elections, not for local elections. So to some extent, the question might be, should we enshrine that in the Constitution, okay? You know, and that's perhaps what you're here to discuss, rather than the pros and cons of gender quotas per se. So some of the arguments in favour would be that, you know, it's tamper-proof if you put it into the Constitution, much more difficult to change. Another argument would be that it's kind of enshrining the principle, it's underscoring how much we value it. And it's also, you know, there are very, very few European constitutions, the French and the Serbian are the only two, maybe the Greek one, that come to mind that have such provisions in their constitutions, so maybe we'll be global leaders. They're increasingly common, the definition of gender quotas in constitutions in African countries and Asian countries, but perhaps they're not the kind of exemplars that we're wishing to kind of model ourselves on. Arguments against, and you know what I mean, a very pragmatic reason is that it might be quite hard to pass in a referendum, okay? And you know, maybe we need to be practical, and maybe we need to allow the current legislation to kind of embed itself before we start kind of muddying the waters by putting it in the Constitution. And similarly, the argument is it's taken care of legislatively. There's no need to kind of, you know, deal with it in the Constitution. Some would argue that, you know, gender quotas are really a temporary measure and really you shouldn't be messing around in the Constitution with them because then you'd have to remove them at some stage into the future, and so that's an argument against them. Others would argue that it's just fundamentally at odds with the, you know, the individualism that's enshrined in our Constitution and kind of the notion of non-discrimination and individual rights. So those are the sorts of things that you should contemplate as you discuss this rather general topic in the coming hours. And I'll just leave you with an example of a constitution that did change in Europe very recently, the French constitution, and there's more examples of it in the submission document in the appendix at the end. The French changed their preamble to actually put gender quotas into their constitution very, very recently. And you've got to consider, is that kind of a step you'd like to take or not, or are we fine where we are? Okay, thank you.